Max Dalton had imagined that moving to a quiet suburb would finally bring him peace. After a bitter divorce and years of city noise, he longed for the kind of stillness that seeps into the bones, the kind that makes you believe you can start again. The house he bought wasn't grand, but it had character. A 2-story craftsman with weathered cedar panels, a long driveway shaded by maples, and a porch that creaked with the sound of memory. He told himself he didn't need anything else. The first weeks were calm in a way that felt almost fragile. He spent his mornings repainting the porch, trimming the bushes, and drinking coffee on the front steps while the sun climbed over the rooftops. The neighborhood seemed friendly enough. Families walking dogs, kids riding bikes, neighbors waving from behind garden fences. There was only one who stood out, the man who lived directly next door, James Hunt. He was tall, impeccably dressed even on weekends, and had the kind of confidence that came from authority. He worked for the local government, something in the planning department, and he introduced himself with the polished politeness of someone who believed introductions were formalities rather than genuine gestures. At first, Max appreciated the civility. Hunt offered advice about waste collection schedules, local bylaws, and even mentioned that he kept an eye on things in the neighborhood, as if his presence alone guaranteed order. It was harmless talk, Max thought. Some men simply needed to feel important. But there was something in Hunt's tone, a certain coldness beneath the courtesy, that never quite sat right with him. The man smiled often, yet his eyes never followed the smile. Over time, Max noticed that Hunt always seemed to appear whenever he was working outside, watering the lawn, repairing the fence, unloading tools from the car. He would stand at the edge of his own property, hands in pockets, making small comments about regulations, easements, and how the driveway alignment between their lots was technically outdated. It was the kind of conversation you dismissed at first, until you realized it was being repeated with precision, as if rehearsed. Still, Max didn't want conflict. He had promised himself that this new chapter of life would be free from the exhausting arguments that had defined his marriage and his years in the city. So when Hunt's tone grew slightly more patronizing, Max forced a smile and nodded. When Hunt mentioned he had some influence at City Hall, Max pretended to be impressed. He didn't see the harm in indulging a neighbor's ego, but that tolerance, he would later realize, was the seed of his own downfall. One Friday evening, as the lights softened into gold and the air smelled faintly of rain, Max returned from a grocery run to find Hunt standing near the end of his driveway. He was studying something on the ground with the same focus one might give a crime scene. Max rolled down his window and called out a casual greeting, but Hunt didn't respond right away. He finally looked up, his expression unreadable. "You know," he said slowly, "this section of pavement might extend a few inches over the property line." "It's nothing serious, but I've been reviewing boundary maps." Max laughed it off, saying the driveway had been there for decades and the city records confirmed its placement. Hunt only smiled in return, thinly, almost pityingly, and said, "Boundaries are never as fixed as people think." Then he walked away. That night, Max couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his chest. It was absurd to be rattled by a single remark, yet there was something in the way Hunt had said it, a calm certainty, a quiet threat wrapped in civility. The next morning, he convinced himself he was overthinking. He brewed coffee, opened the windows, and tried to drown his thoughts in the normalcy of weekend chores. But as he stepped outside, the air felt different, heavier somehow, and when he looked toward the street, he saw Hunt standing again by his fence, watching silently. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Hunt nodded, turned, and disappeared into his garage. Max told himself it was nothing, just the behavior of a man too absorbed in his own authority. He didn't yet understand that this neighbor, with his clean-cut image and bureaucratic calm, was about to become his personal warden. The driveway he had parked on so many times without a thought would soon become a trap, and the small-town order that once seemed so safe would turn into a cage. For now, though, the only sound was the wind brushing through the maple leaves, whispering softly over the stillness of a life that was about to unravel. It began on a Monday morning that should have been ordinary. The air was clear, the sun sharp, and Max woke up feeling rested for the first time in weeks. He brewed coffee, gathered his tools, and planned to spend the day fixing the gutter along the roofline. When he stepped outside, however, The sight waiting for him froze him mid-step. His driveway, the one leading from the garage to the street, was completely blocked by a wall of cement blocks stacked in a perfect, deliberate barricade. They weren't haphazardly dumped there. They were aligned with the precision of a construction site barrier, heavy gray cubes of stone pressed together in two neat rows, leaving no space for a car to pass through. For several seconds, Max could only stare, coffee cup cooling in his hand, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. His first thought was that it had to be a mistake, maybe a delivery gone wrong, or road work that had somehow targeted the wrong property. But there were no city markings, no construction cones, no workers in sight. Only the quiet hum of morning, bird song, and the sight of James Hunt standing across the street with his arms folded, watching. When their eyes met, Hunt smiled faintly, the kind of smile that pretends to be polite, but hides amusement. Max walked toward him, confusion tightening into irritation. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, pointing to the blocks. Hunt tilted his head, feigning surprise. Good morning, Max. I assumed you got the notice." "This section of your driveway encroaches on municipal access space. It's not technically private property. The blocks are a temporary measure until the matter is resolved." His tone was calm, bureaucratic, almost soothing. Max blinked, unable to process what he was hearing. "Municipal access? I own this driveway. I have the title, the survey, everything." Hunt gave a small shrug. "Boundaries shift over time. Records get updated. It's a gray area, really." He used that word deliberately. Gray, like the blocks themselves. "Anyway," he added, "you can still walk out. No one's keeping you from leaving." Max stared at him, disbelief turning into anger. "You're blocking my car. I can't even move it." Hunt's expression didn't change. "Well, technically, you shouldn't have parked so close to the boundary. I've already filed a report with the city, so until that's sorted, the barrier stays." Max felt the heat rise in his chest. "You can't just block someone's property." Hunt's smile faltered slightly. "Actually, I can. I'm acting under administrative authority. It's for public safety." Then, as if nothing significant had happened, he turned and walked back toward his house. For several minutes, Max stood there, trying to convince himself this was some kind of bureaucratic misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a phone call. He went back inside, dug through his files, and found the property deed and survey map, both of which clearly showed the driveway within his lot lines. Armed with proof, he called the city's zoning department. After being transferred between departments for nearly an hour, he finally reached someone who promised to look into it. When he mentioned Hunt's name, there was a long pause on the other end of the line, followed by a cautious, "Mister, Hunt does have influence in planning matters. Maybe give it a day or two." The tone made Max's stomach drop. He realized, with a creeping sense of dread, that this wasn't a misunderstanding at all. By midday, the cement wall felt less like an obstacle and more like a symbol, a warning carved in stone. He couldn't move his car, couldn't go to work, couldn't even receive a delivery. When he tried to chip away at one of the blocks with a hammer, the sound drew Hunt out of his house almost immediately. He stood on his porch, phone in hand, and said evenly, "I'd advise against damaging public property, Max." "That could be considered vandalism." His voice carried just enough authority to make Max stop. There was something chilling about how easily Hunt could turn every situation to his advantage, how he spoke with the calm certainty of someone who knew no one would question him. That evening, Max decided to call the police. When the patrol car arrived, he felt a moment of relief, until he saw the officers speaking with Hunt first. Hunt handed them a clipboard with papers clipped neatly in place, gesturing toward the driveway as if giving a presentation. The officers listened, nodded, and walked over to Max with expressions of polite discomfort. "Sir," one of them said, "your neighbor here has a permit from the city authorizing temporary boundary protection. Until the matter's reviewed, we can't intervene." Max stared at them, stunned. "You're telling me I can't move my car out of my own driveway?" The officer shifted uncomfortably. It's a civil dispute, not criminal. Best to resolve it through the city. He hesitated, then added quietly, "Don't make it worse for yourself, okay?" As the police drove away, Hunt gave a small wave from his porch, the faintest glimmer of triumph in his eyes. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the cement blocks cast long, heavy shadows across the pavement. Max felt trapped, not just physically, but psychologically. The isolation was unbearable. Every time he looked out the window, he saw that wall, unmoving, silent, indifferent. It wasn't just blocking his car anymore. It was blocking his sense of freedom. The next morning, Max tried to work from home, but his mind kept circling back to the barrier outside. When a delivery truck arrived with supplies for his renovation project, the driver took one look at the blocked driveway and refused to unload, saying he couldn't risk a fine. Hunt was watching again, pretending to water his plants. At one point, their eyes met, and Max saw something new there: satisfaction. He realized Hunt wanted him frustrated, isolated, desperate. He wanted him to break first. That night, sleep wouldn't come. Max sat at the kitchen table, staring at the property map spread out before him. Every logical explanation had been exhausted. He had proof of ownership, but that proof meant nothing against someone who could bend the system. Around midnight, he stepped outside, barefoot on the cool pavement, and walked to the edge of the barrier. The cement blocks stood like tombstones, perfectly aligned, their edges glinting under the porch light. He placed a hand on one, feeling its rough, cold surface. Somewhere beyond those stones, Hunt's porch light flickered on, and through the shadows, Max saw him standing there, motionless, watching. For the first time since moving to the neighborhood, Max felt genuine fear. Not the sudden jolt of danger, but the slow, suffocating kind. The kind that crawls under your skin and whispers that someone has taken control of your life without ever laying a hand on you. He turned back toward his house, heart pounding, knowing this was no longer about property lines or permits. It was about dominance, about one man using power as a weapon. And Max, standing in the soft glow of his porch light, realized that the war for his freedom had just begun. For 2 days, Max tried to convince himself the situation would resolve itself. He kept calling city offices, left messages for clerks, emailed departments, and even filed an official complaint through an online portal that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 90s. Each time he mentioned Hunt's name, he received the same tight, polite response: a pause, a sigh, and a promise to look into it. The pattern was unmistakable. Hunt wasn't just a neighbor with an attitude. He was someone who had woven himself into the machinery of the town's bureaucracy, someone who knew exactly which gears to jam and which to oil. Max had dealt with difficult people before, but never with someone who could twist the law into a cage. Every sound outside reminded him of that reality. The scrape of Hunt's shovel on his walkway, the heavy echo of a car door slamming at dawn, the low murmur of voices when other neighbors came to chat with him. Hunt always stood just close enough to be heard, but far enough to maintain plausible deniability. He was careful, methodical, almost professional in his intimidation. On the third morning, Max woke to the sound of a vehicle idling outside his house. When he stepped out, he found 2 workers in reflective vests taking pictures of his driveway. They didn't answer when he asked what they were doing. One of them just pointed toward Hunt's house and said, "We're under instruction." Within minutes, they were gone, leaving behind small orange flags staked into the soil near the edge of the driveway. Max pulled one up, realizing it marked the supposed municipal boundary Hunt had mentioned. His stomach tightened. Hunt wasn't waiting for a resolution. He was building a case, crafting a paper trail that would make his intrusion look legitimate. By that afternoon, Max's frustration began to curdle into anger. He grabbed his phone and started recording a video of the barrier, narrating what had happened, documenting every detail: the date, the blocks, the workers, everything. As he spoke, Hunt appeared again, walking toward him with that same calculated calm. "Still filming, Max?" he asked lightly, as if they were discussing the weather. "I suppose you're planning to post that online. Careful, defamation laws are quite strict." His smile was thin, almost tender. Max lowered the phone and said through clenched teeth, "Move the blocks, James. This isn't legal and you know it." Hunt's gaze flickered briefly, then hardened. "You should be careful who you accuse of illegality. I'm an employee of the city. Everything I do is documented. You, on the other hand, seem awfully emotional." He turned away before Max could respond, disappearing behind his door like a man closing a courtroom after delivering the verdict. Later that day, Max received an email from the local homeowners association, informing him that a complaint had been filed regarding unauthorized modifications to his property boundary. The sender's address looked familiar, an official HOA email. But the wording was eerily specific, almost as if Hunt himself had written it. The message warned that failure to comply with local boundary ordinances could result in fines. Max felt his pulse pounding in his temples. It wasn't just a feud anymore. It was a siege. Hunt was using every institutional tool available, crafting a web of rules, forms, and accusations to box him in. That night, Max decided he had had enough. He called the police again, explaining that he was being unlawfully confined on his own property. The dispatcher sounded skeptical but agreed to send another patrol. When the officers arrived, Hunt was already outside, calm and ready, holding another folder of documents. He greeted them like old colleagues, shaking hands and speaking in that steady, bureaucratic cadence Max was beginning to despise. Max tried to interject, showing the officers his property deed, the survey, the videos, but they hesitated, unsure whom to believe. One of them pulled Max aside, his tone sympathetic but resigned. "Sir, the thing is, your neighbor works with the city. He knows the codes better than anyone. Unless you have a court order, there's not much we can do." Max felt the ground tilt beneath him. "You're saying I can't even drive my car out?" The officer gave a reluctant shrug. "I'm saying it's a civil issue. If you move those blocks, you could be charged with destruction of public property." "I'm sorry." After they left, Hunt lingered on his porch, watching Max with that same faint smile. He didn't have to speak. The silence said enough. Max stormed back inside and slammed the door, his hands trembling with rage. He paced the kitchen, his reflection flickering in the darkened window like a ghost. It wasn't just the helplessness that burned. It was the humiliation, the knowledge that Hunt had planned this perfectly. Max realized that every call, every confrontation, every emotional outburst played directly into his neighbor's hands. Hunt wanted him angry, because anger could be used against him. The next day, Max tried a different approach. He drove a rental car and parked it on the street a few houses down, walking back to his property with a camera in hand. He recorded himself measuring the driveway, showing how clearly the boundary lines contradicted Hunt's claims. When he uploaded the footage to a private cloud, he felt, for the first time in days, a flicker of control. But that flicker dimmed quickly when he saw Hunt speaking with another neighbor across the street. The conversation looked friendly, even warm, until both men glanced toward Max's house. Their voices dropped, and the other neighbor's expression changed. Wary, disapproving. Max understood then that Hunt was doing more than blocking his driveway. He was poisoning the well of community around him, turning neighbors into silent witnesses or quiet accomplices. That evening, as dusk spread over the street, Max heard movement outside his window. He looked out and saw Hunt standing beside the wall of blocks again, inspecting them as though conducting an official audit. He held a clipboard and flashlight, muttering notes to himself. When Max stepped outside and asked what he was doing, Hunt didn't look up. "Routine documentation," he said. "We've had complaints about your conduct. I'm making sure everything remains compliant." His tone was calm, but the subtext was venomous. "I'm in control, and no one will believe you." Max returned inside and sat in the dark, staring at the faint blue glow of his security monitor. The camera feed showed the driveway, the immovable gray wall, and Hunt's figure moving like a slow metronome in the night. Every instinct screamed to tear down the blocks, to reclaim his freedom by force, but logic held him back. He couldn't afford a charge of vandalism. That was what Hunt wanted. A single slip to destroy his credibility. Sleep eluded him again. He lay awake, listening to the quiet hum of the house, every creak magnified by tension. Around 2 a.m, headlights flashed briefly outside and a car door shut softly. Through the blinds, he saw Hunt again, this time speaking to someone in a city maintenance truck. They exchanged a few words, then both looked toward Max's house. The truck drove off after a few minutes, leaving Hunt alone in the pale wash of the streetlight. He stood there for a while, motionless, before finally retreating to his house. By dawn, Max understood something had shifted irrevocably. This wasn't a temporary power play or a neighborly disagreement. Hunt was orchestrating something larger, an abuse of authority wrapped in the thin veneer of procedure. Max poured a cup of coffee, hands trembling, and made a silent vow. He would stop reacting and start documenting every word, every visit, every act of intimidation. If Hunt wanted a legal war, Max would give him one, but he would fight it by the book, meticulously and mercilessly. For now, though, as sunlight spilled over the pale cement wall outside, he could only stare at the barricade that had turned his home into a prison, and wonder how much longer it would take before someone in power decided that his freedom mattered. Less than his neighbor's paperwork. By the end of the second week, Max's patience had curdled into something heavier, a kind of simmering dread that lived in the pit of his stomach. The cement wall still stood, gray and immovable, casting its long shadow across his drive each morning, as if to remind him of who held power now. His calls to the city had gone unanswered for days, and the last email from the planning department had been a masterpiece of bureaucratic indifference, vague, evasive, and politely useless. He had stopped counting how many times he had explained the situation to new clerks, each one pretending to take notes while gently suggesting he consult a lawyer. That phrase had become the echo of his mornings. Consult a lawyer. As if justice were a luxury item to be purchased by the hour. On the 14th day, he did exactly that. He sat in the small office of a property attorney named Lila Parsons, a sharp woman in her late 30s with the steady calm of someone used to staring down impossible cases. She listened without interrupting, her fingers tapping lightly on the edge of her desk as Max laid out every detail. The blocks, the police visits, Hunt's position with the city, even the subtle campaign of intimidation. When he finally ran out of words, she leaned back in her chair, exhaled, and said, "What he's doing could qualify as false imprisonment. It's rare in property disputes, but it applies here if you can prove intent." The phrase hit Max like a spark in the dark. False imprisonment. It sounded too extreme for the quiet suburban street he lived on, but as she explained it, he realized how accurately it fit. He was being confined to his own property, trapped by someone abusing their authority under the guise of procedure. Lila told him that Hunt's use of municipal justification might protect him superficially, but if the blocks had no legitimate permit attached, his entire defense would crumble. "We'll start by filing an injunction," she said. "But I want evidence. Everything you have. Dates, video, copies of the supposed city paperwork, any witness statements. The more documentation, the stronger the case." Max nodded, already picturing the folders of notes and footage he had been collecting. For the first time in weeks, he felt the faint, almost unfamiliar flicker of hope. It wasn't victory yet, but it was motion. Finally, something pushing back against the weight of Hunt's control. When Max returned home that afternoon, Hunt was outside again, trimming his hedges with the casual composure of a man who believed himself untouchable. He looked up briefly, offered a neighborly smile, and said, "Ah, I see you've been out. Any progress with City Hall?" The smug familiarity in his tone made Max's skin crawl, but he said nothing. He simply nodded, unlocked his door, and went inside. That silence, he knew, was more powerful than anger. If Hunt noticed he was no longer taking the bait, it might unsettle him. That night, Max organized his evidence, compiling video files, copies of correspondence, and the photographs of the city workers who had appeared without explanation. While doing so, he noticed something strange in one of the images, a small municipal seal printed on one of the workers' clipboards. It bore a date that was clearly altered. The last digit of the year had been overwritten by hand. A forgery, crude but deliberate. He zoomed in on the picture, the realization sinking in. Hunt wasn't just bending the law, he was fabricating it. The next morning, Max returned to Lila's office and handed her the evidence. She examined the photo and nodded grimly. "That's all I need to request a verification from the city records department," she said. "If this permit doesn't exist in their database, we can prove Hunt falsified official documents." The thought filled Max with both relief and fear. Relief because it meant Hunt could finally be held accountable. Fear because he understood what it meant to challenge a man who had spent years building his power through quiet intimidation. Lila warned him that once they filed the report, things might escalate. "People like Hunt don't back down," she said. "They double down. Be prepared for that." Her prediction proved right almost immediately. 2 days later, Max found a bright orange notice taped to his front door, accusing him of violating property appearance ordinances and demanding he remove unsanctioned structures from his lawn within 72 hours. The irony would have been laughable if it hadn't been so sinister. The notice was unsigned but stamped with the HOA insignia, the same one Hunt had previously cited. He took a photo of it, then called Lila. She sighed audibly through the phone. "Retaliation," she said. "Keep the notice. Don't respond. I'll add it to the file." But the notice was only the beginning. Over the next few days, strange things began happening around Max's home. His mail was delivered soaking wet, as if someone had poured water into the box. His trash bins were found overturned, contents scattered across his lawn. One morning he woke to find the air in his tires let out, the car sitting lopsided and useless. None of it could be proven, but every incident carried the same fingerprint of petty malice. One evening, Max returned from the store to find Hunt standing by the wall again, holding a phone to his ear. When he saw Max, he ended the call and said, "You should be careful who you involve in this. You're stirring up unnecessary attention." His voice was low and steady, but the threat beneath it was unmistakable. Max stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest. "You've already crossed the line, James. This isn't about attention. It's about what's right." Hunt smirked faintly, tilting his head. "What's right?" he repeated softly, as if savoring the absurdity of the phrase. "What's right is what's enforceable. You'll learn that eventually." Then he turned and walked back toward his house, his silhouette fading into the porch light. Max stood there breathing hard, his fists clenched. It was no longer about the driveway. It was about power, about control, about the kind of man who believed laws were weapons meant to be wielded, not followed. The next morning, Lila called with news that shifted the entire case. The city clerk she had contacted confirmed that no permit or record existed under the number listed on Hunt's documents. Not only that, but the formatting of the supposed authorization was inconsistent with any legitimate municipal paperwork. "He forged it," she said flatly. "And if he used his city credentials in the process, that's not just fraud. It's abuse of authority." She was already preparing the complaint for the district attorney's office. Max listened in stunned silence, barely able to process what he was hearing. After weeks of powerlessness, the balance had begun to shift, even if only slightly. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. "Now," she said. "We give him a chance to hang himself. Don't confront him. Let the system do what it's supposed to do." But Hunt must have sensed that something was turning against him. The following evening, Max received another visitor, a man in a crisp suit, who introduced himself as a representative of the Municipal Review Board. His tone was measured, polite, and utterly rehearsed. He claimed the city was conducting a follow-up inspection on Hunt's temporary boundary project and requested to enter Max's property to verify conditions. Max, now cautious, refused entry and asked for identification. The man produced a badge with a laminate sheen that looked too new, the seal slightly misaligned. "You can schedule a formal visit through my attorney," Max said, shutting the gate. The man didn't argue. He simply smiled and said, "Suit yourself, but people who make trouble for the city tend to regret it." Then he turned and walked back to a dark sedan parked down the street. Max stood frozen for a moment, the echo of the man's words lingering in the still air. That night he called Lila again. "They're trying to scare you," she said calmly. "Don't let them. I've filed the complaint with the DA. It's out of Hunt's hands now." But as she spoke, Max could see the faint glow of Hunt's porch light across the street. He was standing outside again, arms crossed, looking directly at Max's house. The sight sent a chill through him. This wasn't just a man facing exposure. It was a man cornered, a man who had spent years manipulating others and was now feeling the first cracks in his armor. And cornered men, Max knew, were dangerous. Sleep came late that night, shallow and restless. When Max finally drifted off, he dreamed of the wall of blocks collapsing in slow motion, the cement crumbling into dust that filled his lungs until he couldn't breathe. He woke gasping, drenched in sweat, his pulse hammering. Through the window, dawn was bleeding into the sky, gray and heavy. He sat on the edge of the bed and realized that his life had become a series of small awakenings, each day revealing another layer of corruption, another truth about how fragile freedom really was when one man decided to twist the system for his own control. The balance was beginning to tip, and though fear lingered in every quiet corner of his house, so did something else: determination. Hunt might have built the wall, but Max was the one who would bring it down. The first sign that things were about to turn uglier came on a windy Thursday morning when Max stepped outside and found his mailbox hanging open, its metal door twisted as if someone had pried it with a tool. Inside was an envelope without a return address, folded neatly around a single printed page. The message was short, almost clinical. Cease all contact with city officials regarding the driveway dispute. Continued interference will result in penalties and potential criminal investigation. The letter bore no signature, only a generic letterhead marked Department of Urban Compliance. The font looked official enough to fool an untrained eye, but to Max it reeked of forgery. He held it in his hands for a long time, the paper trembling slightly between his fingers, before folding it carefully and taking a photograph for Lila. When he called her, she confirmed his suspicion. It wasn't real. "He's manufacturing fear," she said. "He's trying to make you feel like every institution is his weapon. Don't let him succeed." But that was easier said than done. Within days, Hunt began escalating his tactics with a precision that bordered on obsession. A citation appeared on Max's door accusing him of improper waste disposal. 2 days later, an anonymous complaint claimed that he had violated noise regulations for operating power tools late at night, tools he hadn't even used in over a week. The timing of each accusation was too perfect, the language too bureaucratic to be coincidence. Hunt was playing both sides of the system, using his inside knowledge to weaponize the very codes meant to protect residents. What infuriated Max most wasn't the pettiness. It was the sense of invisibility. Every form, every notice, every accusation came from a faceless entity, leaving him fighting shadows while Hunt stood calmly next door, sipping coffee on his porch, the very picture of suburban serenity. One afternoon, Max decided to confront him directly. He walked across the lawn, his heart pounding, and stopped a few feet from where Hunt was polishing his car. "Enough," Max said, his voice shaking but firm. "You think you can bury me under paperwork, but it's over? I've already spoken to the DA's office. They know about the forged documents." Hunt didn't even flinch. He leaned against the car, folded his arms, and studied Max with something that almost resembled pity. "You think they'll believe you?" he asked quietly. "You think they'll take your word over mine? You're a man with a grudge, and I'm a man with a record of service. Paper trails don't scare me, Max. They're how I survive." The calmness in his tone was worse than anger. It was the sound of a man who believed himself untouchable. "You should stop before this gets worse," Hunt added, his voice lowering. "You don't know how many friends I have." Max stared at him for a long moment, feeling a slow, dark fury rise in his chest. But he forced himself to turn away. If he lashed out now, it would only prove Hunt's narrative, that he was unstable, volatile, the kind of man who deserved to be contained. That night, as Max reviewed footage from his security cameras, he caught something that made his blood run cold. Around 2 a.m, a figure appeared on the edge of the frame, moving carefully along the fence line. The man wore a dark jacket, gloves and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He carried a flashlight but kept it aimed at the ground, as though avoiding detection. The grainy image showed him crouching near the side gate, fiddling with something before disappearing into the darkness. The next morning, Max found the latch on his gate broken and muddy footprints leading toward the driveway. Nothing else appeared stolen or damaged, but the message was unmistakable. Someone had been there, on his land, testing his boundaries. When he showed the footage to Lila, she didn't hesitate. "This is harassment," she said. "If we can connect him to this, it strengthens everything. File a police report and make sure they log it formally." Max did exactly that, though he could tell from the officer's weary tone that it would go nowhere. "We'll keep it on record," the officer said, scribbling notes without enthusiasm. "But unless there's clear identification, it's circumstantial." Max wanted to shout, to grab him by the shoulders and demand that he look harder, but he stopped himself. Hunt had already poisoned the perception of him. Losing control would only feed the image of an unstable man spiraling into paranoia. Days turned into weeks, and the psychological weight of the standoff began to show. Max's sleep fractured into short bursts, his appetite faded, and he began jumping at every small noise outside. Hunt seemed to sense the exhaustion, appearing more often in small, calculated ways. A wave from his porch, a comment about the weather that lingered too long, a polite reminder that the city still hasn't approved that driveway modification. Each interaction was a needle, small but deliberate. The final straw came on a Sunday afternoon when Max returned from a grocery run to find a new barrier added to the existing wall, 2 steel posts with a heavy chain stretched between them, secured by a padlock. A small laminated sign hung from the chain reading, "Restricted access, under review by municipal authority." It was pure theater, but it had its intended effect. Max stood there for a long time, hands trembling, before he reached for his phone and started recording again. His voice, when he spoke, was low and controlled. "This is evidence," he said. "This is unlawful imprisonment. This is proof of what he's done." Lila urged him to stay calm, but even she sounded unsettled when he showed her the footage. "We're moving forward," she said. "I've already sent everything to the prosecutor. If he's found guilty of document falsification, his entire case collapses, and his job goes with it." Her words gave Max a fragile sense of stability, but it didn't last. That night, someone threw a handful of nails into his driveway, sharp points glittering under the porch light. He found them when he stepped out to check his mail, one embedding itself into the sole of his shoe. Rage welled up in him so quickly it almost frightened him. He crouched, picked up the nails one by one, and carried them to Hunt's front step, scattering them in a silent act of defiance. It wasn't rational and it wasn't strategic, but it felt like taking back a fragment of power, however small. The following morning, a police cruiser arrived. 2 officers approached his door, calm and formal, informing him that a complaint had been filed against him for property damage and harassment. Max could barely contain his disbelief as he tried to explain the context, but they only noted his statement and handed him a warning notice. As they left, Hunt appeared once again on his porch, holding a coffee mug and smiling faintly. "Careful, Max," he called out. "You're starting to look like the aggressor." The words hit harder than they should have, because Max knew that, in the eyes of an indifferent system, perception was everything. Later that evening, Max sat in the dim glow of his kitchen, reviewing his files for the 100th time. The evidence was strong, but the battle was wearing him down. It wasn't just about legalities anymore. It was about sanity, about the slow corrosion of self that happens when you're forced to live under constant siege. Then, just as fatigue began to drag at his thoughts, his phone buzzed. It was Lila. "We have a hearing date," she said. "Next week. The DA's office wants to move fast. They've found internal discrepancies in Hunt's work history. Other complaints, small but consistent. This isn't just about you anymore." For a long time, Max didn't answer. He just listened to the steady hum of her voice, the faint edge of resolve beneath her professionalism. For the first time in months, the situation no longer felt entirely hopeless. Hunt had built his wall to keep Max trapped, but in his arrogance, He had also built his own downfall, brick by brick. Max ended the call, stood at the window, and looked out at the pale barrier glinting under the streetlight. It was still there, a monument to control and cruelty. But soon, he thought, it would become something else. Evidence. The courthouse smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper, the kind of scent that carries equal parts authority and decay. Max sat at the wooden table beside Lila, his palms damp despite the chill in the air. Across the room, James Hunt adjusted his tie with the casual confidence of a man who had lived his whole life in buildings like this, where truth was less about facts and more about who controlled the narrative. His attorney, a polished man with a silver tie pin, whispered something in his ear that made Hunt's lips curl into that same faint, condescending smile Max had come to hate. The judge entered. The murmurs died down, and for a moment the room was heavy with the silence that precedes conflict. When the case was called, Dalton versus Hunt, allegations of false imprisonment, abuse of authority, and document falsification, Hunt didn't flinch. He simply folded his hands and waited. Lila spoke first, her voice calm and deliberate. She laid out the timeline like a map of controlled chaos. The forged permit, the illegal barriers, the fake citations, the intimidation disguised as procedure. Each exhibit appeared on the screen as she spoke. Photographs of the driveway, video of the barrier, the grainy security footage showing a figure prowling near Max's gate, and finally the city clerk's affidavit confirming that the permit number Hunt had submitted never existed. The evidence built slowly, methodically, layer by layer until the courtroom began to shift, the tone of quiet skepticism giving way to unease. When she finished, there was a stillness so complete that Max could hear his own breathing. Then Hunt's attorney rose. He began smoothly, with the poise of someone accustomed to bending logic until it begged to be believed. He painted Max as unstable, a man consumed by resentment after a property dispute, a man prone to paranoia and exaggeration. He presented printouts of Max's video recordings, highlighting his angry tone, his late-night rants about injustice. This, the attorney said, gesturing toward the screen, is not the behavior of a rational individual. This is obsession disguised as grievance. He turned slightly, giving the jury a look that implied sympathy. Mr. Hunt was simply doing his duty as a public servant, ensuring neighborhood compliance and safety. The plaintiff's accusations are not only unfounded, they're defamatory. Max felt the blood drain from his face. The strategy was perfect. Twist his frustration into evidence of instability, his determination into proof of malice. But before despair could settle in, Lila stood again, her expression unreadable. "May I recall the witness?" she asked. The judge nodded. Hunt was sworn in, and as he took the stand, Max saw for the first time something flicker behind his composure, a trace of caution, maybe even fear. Lila began gently, asking about his position at the city office, his responsibilities, his access to municipal databases. He answered smoothly, rehearsed and professional. Then she presented a document, a scanned email, retrieved through a subpoena, between Hunt and a subordinate employee. The message was short, dated 2 days before the blockade appeared. Make sure the old permit form template is ready. I'll handle the signatures. The courtroom seemed to exhale collectively. Hunt's jaw tightened, the faint muscle near his temple twitching. Lila pressed on, her voice now colder, sharper. Mr. Hunt, are you aware that fabricating a municipal permit is a felony offense under state law? He didn't answer at first, his eyes darting briefly toward his lawyer, who was already rising to object. The judge overruled. Answer the question. Hunt swallowed, his voice suddenly smaller. I acted in good faith. The boundary issue was ongoing. I only expedited the process. Lila stepped closer. By creating documents that didn't exist. By anticipating approval, Hunt snapped, the veneer cracking for the first time. The words hung in the air, damning in their arrogance. The courtroom murmured, and even the judge's expression darkened. When the hearing adjourned for the day, Max stepped outside into the cold afternoon light, the sound of traffic distant and unreal. For the first time since this ordeal began, he felt the invisible pressure lift from his chest. Hunt avoided his gaze as they passed in the hallway, but the tremor in his hand as he adjusted his tie told Max everything he needed to know. The man who had built his power on control was losing it. Lila touched his shoulder lightly. "We'll get a ruling tomorrow," she said, "but I think you can breathe now." He nodded, though he wasn't sure he could. Breathing had become something mechanical, something he did between moments of tension. The next morning, the decision came swiftly. The judge ruled in Max's favor, citing clear evidence of falsified documentation, abuse of public authority, and deliberate confinement without legal cause. Hunt was ordered to remove all barriers immediately, pay damages, and face administrative suspension pending a full criminal investigation. The words rolled over Max like a tide, measured, official, irreversible. Hunt's face was pale as marble, his composure gone. When the gavel struck, it sounded like the collapse of something far greater than a wall of concrete. It was the sound of a man's empire breaking apart. Outside, the news spread quickly. Reporters gathered by the courthouse steps, microphones thrust toward Max as questions poured in. How it started, what it felt like, whether justice had been served. He answered quietly, choosing his words with care. "No one should be able to weaponize authority against another person," he said. "This wasn't about property. It was about control. And it ends now." Cameras flashed, voices overlapped, but beneath the chaos there was a strange, still calm inside him. The wall, the fear, the helplessness, all of it had been real, but so was this moment of reclamation. That evening, as Max returned home, the driveway looked different. The city crew had already come to remove the blocks, leaving only faint scuff marks on the pavement where they had stood. The air smelled faintly of wet cement and rain. Across the street, Hunt's house was dark, the window shut, the porch empty. For the first time in months, Max parked his car, stepped out, and stood in silence, breathing deeply. The world felt open again, wide and possible. He looked down at the bare stretch of driveway and realized that victory didn't feel triumphant. It felt quiet, grounded, heavy with the memory of what it had cost. The scars would stay, invisible, but permanent, reminders of how close one man had come to turning an entire life into a prison. But tonight, for the first time, the space before him was clear. The weeks that followed felt almost unreal, as if the world were trying to remember how to move forward after being held still for too long. The cement dust had been washed away by rain, and the empty stretch of driveway now looked so ordinary that Max sometimes had to remind himself it had once been a wall, a symbol of everything that had trapped him. Neighbors who had kept their distance began stopping by again, bringing cautious smiles and awkward apologies. Some admitted they had believed Hunt's version of events, that they'd thought Max was the troublemaker. He didn't hold it against them. Fear made people obedient, and Hunt had known exactly how to cultivate it. Hunt's downfall unfolded publicly and mercilessly. The investigation revealed years of quiet corruption, altered permits, manipulated zoning reports, favors exchanged behind closed doors. When the city dismissed him, the headlines called it a scandal. For Max, it was simply justice wearing an ordinary face. He never saw Hunt again. The man vanished from the neighborhood overnight, leaving his house dark and empty, a shell of arrogance and secrecy. Yet even in his absence, the echoes remained, the long shadow of power misused and the quiet trauma of being silenced. Max tried to rebuild his life slowly, deliberately. He replaced the old security cameras, repaired the damaged gate, and planted a line of junipers along the edge of the property where the blocks had once stood. The work was methodical, grounding. Each planted tree felt like a small declaration that peace wasn't something granted, it was reclaimed. Sometimes, late at night, he would sit on the porch with a cup of coffee and watch the street. It was quiet again, but never in the same way. The silence now carried memory. It was heavier, more honest. When reporters occasionally called for follow-up interviews, Max declined. He didn't want to be a symbol or a headline. The story had already served its purpose. It had exposed something rotten beneath the neat surface of suburban order. What mattered now was living without fear, without the constant pulse of anger that had driven him for so long. The driveway, once a prison gate, had become his proof that even the smallest victory could restore something vast inside a person. On the first evening of summer, he stood by the edge of the driveway, the air warm and humming with cicadas. The faint scent of wet earth and pine drifted through the yard. For a long time he simply stood there, hands in his pockets, watching the sunset stain the asphalt in gold. There was no wall now. No neighbor watching from behind a curtain, no weight pressing on his chest. Just space. Quiet, open, and entirely his.